Mark, you could, as you suggest there, be forgiven for a sense of déjà vu. Labour keen for a fight about health, a robust response from the Tories. A little less expected, perhaps, that the reporting of our own Nick Robinson was quite so prominent.
One of the most respected political journalists in Britain, Nick Robinson, the political editor of the BBC, said this, and I'm going to quote it however long it takes, Mr. Speaker. A phrase the Labour leader uses in private is that he wants to, and I quote, weaponise the NHS for politics.
A slight surprise, I can tell you, for our respected political editor, who's engaged in the health debate today only insofar as he's at home, feeling a bit poorly. As Robinson took an aspirin, Labour pushed on. This line tends to make them feel a bit nauseous as well, all just a way they think to avoid debating the real issue.
This is a ridiculous smokescreen from a Prime Minister running from his record on the NHS.
As if to emphasise all the talks of fights, battles and campaigns we've had recently, Ed Miliband took a military turn, responding to repeated charges that Labour had failed the Welsh Health Service like this.
This is a man who's got a war on Wales and is using the Welsh NHS to make political propaganda.
A war on Wales, quite a soundbite. Or it would have been, had the Speaker not interrupted halfway through. We can only guess at the Labour leader's frustration. General allegations are one thing, but Labour had a very direct one today, that guidance was issued to NHS hospitals in the West Midlands over when they could call major incidents. Labour's leader said,
"Can he explain this morning why new guidance has been issued to some hospitals, making it harder for them to declare a major incident?"
The Prime Minister could explain, and he had an official to back up his version of events.
The NHS in the West Midlands, without any instruction from the Department of Health, without any instruction from ministers, issued a statement about major incidents. The head of NHS England was asked about it this morning, and she said this, "I haven't been under any political pressure. This document was issued in the West Midlands."
Now, rowing about the NHS in broad terms will go on, of course it will, but the debate about trust and competence, which is what it amounts to, may in the end turn on who's convincing on these rather specific questions.
And we'll be returning to the NHS in a moment, but you've been speaking to a senior Welsh politician about Trident.
Yeah, just before all that began, I was in the central lobby of the House of Commons talking to Lord Wigley, David Wigley, former leader of Plaid Cymru and now their election coordinator. The topic was, as you mentioned, that story in the Daily Mail today suggesting the Ministry of Defence was exploring the possibility of moving the Trident nuclear base to Wales, something that the MOD has rejected. Now, Lord Wigley was passionately opposed to that idea. The terms he used to make his case were perhaps rather surprising.
Look, this week we've been remembering what happened in Germany before the war. No doubt there were many jobs provided in Auschwitz and places like that. That didn't justify their existence, and neither does nuclear weapons justify having them in Pembrokeshire.
Are you seriously comparing a Trident base to a Nazi death camp?
The number of people that would be killed by Trident would be infinitely more.
No doubt there were many jobs provided in Auschwitz, a phrase that the day after the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the camps could cause quite some reaction.
Yes, indeed. Thanks very much, Ross. It's no wonder that the NHS is at the centre of the debate, though. A spate of hospitals declaring major incidents because of the stress on accident and emergency departments has given momentum to the sense of a health service in the midst of a winter crisis, a service under almost unbearable strain. Now, the BBC has seen new guidelines issued to NHS hospitals in the West Midlands over when they can call major incidents. Inevitably, with the election, as we say, 99 days away, there are accusations that this is political manipulation. Our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, uncovered the story. Norman.
Mark, thanks very much. Well, I was given these new guidelines issued by the NHS in the West Midlands last night, and they are basically a list of 17 criteria which clinicians are asked to consider before plunging a hospital into major incident status, and they range from all sorts of things like have you set up a command and control centre, have you checked you've used all available beds, have you cancelled non-urgent operations, so on and so forth. But what was more interesting than the guidelines was the reaction of some of the clinicians who had been sent these guidelines. Now, Ed Miliband quoted one clinician in the Commons, but I've also seen an email from a consultant in one of the A&E departments, and this is how he described the new guidelines.
It strikes me as an attempt to dampen down the heat and media attention on the emergency departments and their major incidents.
Now, I asked NHS England whether they had sent out these guidelines nationally. They insisted not, that it was entirely a local matter that had been conducted in the West Midlands. Their argument was that this was not so much a ban on declaring major incidents, it was meant to be helpful. And in the Commons in the past few minutes, the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has also insisted that this had nothing to do with ministers.
The decision to declare a major incident is taken locally, and there is no national definition. We must trust the managers and clinicians in our local NHS to make these decisions and support them in doing so by making sure there is sufficient financial support available to help them deal with additional pressures. The document that's been questioned this morning by the opposition health spokesman was issued by the local NHS in the West Midlands. It was done so to help work with local NHS organisations to deal with the unprecedented pressures they've been facing this winter.
However, a new twist in the last few minutes. Labour have released the full 86-page dossier issued by West Midlands and are pointing to one section of it on page 21, headline politics, and the implication of it is that clinicians are also asked to take account not of the clinical pressures on hospitals, but of the likely political and media reaction were they to declare a major incident. It says, amongst other things, is there increasing political involvement or excessive media coverage? Is there a requirement to bolster or assure public confidence? Is there a risk of reputational damage? In other words, before you declare a major incident, have regard to the possible media and political reaction.
Well, thanks very much, Norman. With me as part of our regular panel to discuss PMQs, Mark Harper, the Minister for Disabled People and Conservative MP for the Forest of Dean, Mervyn Coker, the Shadow Defence Secretary and Labour MP for Gedling, in Nottinghamshire. Sorry to any implications towards your constituency there. And Simon Hughes, the Lib Dem Minister for State for Justice and Civil Liberties. Simon Hughes, can I start with you? Do you think this is a subject that has been weaponised here, this particular business of the guidelines?
No, I don't think the guidelines have been weaponised. What I haven't seen the document, it seems entirely sensible. It appears to be regional, not central. It appears to be guidance to people to deal with the issue and the reporting of the issue, and it seems to be very sensible that somebody has thought, well, you've got to make sure you don't alarm your prospective patients or the users of your service. So I don't think that's a weaponising issue at all. I think the bigger debate, bluntly, is the big debate that we've been having, which is a debate where in the last couple of days, Labour launched their health campaign yesterday, I think, and we'll confirm that, but it appears to have fallen apart in a day, particularly over the issue of how much private sector involvement. I know from my own constituency that when Labour were in government, they increased, I've got the figures here, they increased from 2009-10, a private sector, 2004-6-7, 2.6% private sector, to when they came out of office, 4.9.
Well, I do want to get onto that issue, but just on this...
And Andy Burnham now won't say how much more it's going to increase under Labour. He said he won't give a figure. That's the issue. My constituents don't want a privatised health service, but we've actually inherited a health service where some of the services are paid for by the taxpayer in order to get people quicker treatment, but they're completely free to the people who use them. It seems to me that's a reasonable response to an urgent demand for treatment from all our constituents.
But just on this narrow issue, which is still important, Mark Harper, doesn't it sound from what Norman was saying that the guidelines are saying, well, avoid a political fuss, we don't want to hear about it much in the media?
Well, it sounds very clear. This is a document, by my understanding, and the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary both confirmed was issued by the NHS in the West Midlands, not ministers have nothing to do with it, and it's about giving advice to local health services about declaring major incidents when they're coping with the Health Secretary said, unprecedented pressures. I mean, we know there are unprecedented pressures. I think the important thing is to make sure the NHS has the resources that it needs, and you can only give it the resources it needs if you have a strong economy, and that was the point the Prime Minister was making at Prime Minister's questions. We have a long-term economic plan which has been successful, it means we can put those resources into the NHS.
The charge that he's used this term, weaponising the NHS, is going to come back and haunt your leader time and time again.
But I think if people understand that the Labour Party in the run-up to the next election will continue to make the NHS the priority, The reason that we make it a priority is because that's what people say to us up and down the country. People are concerned about what's happening in the NHS. They're worried about access to GPs, worried about... But it's about making it a priority. It's about saying to people, we understand the concerns that you're raising, we understand the problems that you're facing, and we're going to ensure that this remains a major issue right in the way in the run-up to the general election, and we'll continue to come back to this issue. And no matter what the government, represented by 2 MPs here, both the Liberal and the Conservative part of the government here, we will continue to make the case for the NHS, and we will continue to attack the reforms so-called of the government.
I mean, hasn't the Prime Minister seized on this one, perhaps unfortunate phrase, but it's a bit like when people say, oh, you're being political. Well, you're politicians, you're bound to be political. I mean, obviously, you're going to use issues that you think will play to your strengths. I mean, that's all that Ed Miliband was saying, isn't it?
Well, I think Vernon set out a perfectly reasonable case there. The problem is, I think, using language that Ed Miliband, according to Nick Robinson, said, and interestingly he hasn't denied it, I just think is rather distasteful. The NHS is an important public service. We all as constituency MPs know how important it is. What we should be doing is focusing on the practical steps that we can take to put the resources in and make sure it works.
But you're not trusted, are you? I mean, Labour have an 18-point lead over you on the NHS.
The idea, well actually the interesting thing is if you look at the public's view about having an economic plan to generate the resources to get into the health service, actually people do trust us. And I think the lesson actually from the Greek experience is if you forget about the deficit and you don't deal with it, and you don't solve your economic problems, you end up cutting health spending. The Greeks had to cut it by 41%. The Labour administration in Wales, just across the border from my constituency, so I know it from constituency experience, the Labour Party in Wales, the only part of the UK where they actually run the health service, they cut spending on it as well.
Well, the Welsh experience isn't terribly good, is it?
Well, you can selectively quote about the NHS in Wales, but actually if we look at independent reports like the Nuffield Trust report last year, it actually said there was that the NHS in Wales wasn't lagging behind the rest of the health services in the rest of the country. So, and if you look at specific things like cancer, some of the cancer treatment targets, if you look at those with respect to Wales, they're performing better. So, as I say, it depends. You can run the whole NHS Wales system down if you wish to, and continue to attack it. There's some very good work going on in Wales. Of course, there are challenges like we saw with ambulances this morning, and the Welsh Government announcing extra money to try and deal with that.
Can I just ask, what do you think the Blairites are doing? Look at the newspaper headlines this morning, and they're dreadful for your party because of what Alan Milburn said on this programme yesterday. I mean, it looks like they are really just going for Ed Miliband, really attacking him.
Well, I read the newspapers this morning. All I can say is what happens within the Parliamentary Labour Party, what happens within Shadow Cabinet, and we're united behind Ed Miliband and Andy Burnham to try and ensure, yes, the NHS is a priority, but we stand for the vision of the NHS that we have, the need for additional resources, and we've pointed out how we can bring £2.5 billion worth of extra resources into the NHS. This is a major issue for us. We're united in campaigning for that, and we will continue to do so.
I'd quickly like to move on to a different subject. Simon Hughes, will the debates happen now, do you think?
I'm not sure that they will, is the honest answer. It seems to me that we've now moved from the initial proposition, which, from our point of view, didn't allow a party of government to put its case equally with the other party of government, to a position where there are so many players, prospectively, that it becomes a very difficult place. Labour and the Tories now don't appear to be happy unless the Northern Irish parties get involved. If you then think of another 3 parties, or potentially 4 parties being involved, is that realistic? I think it must be absolutely certain. In America, of course, they started, and then they didn't happen for 20 years, so there's no imperative that they get honest judgment, money on it. I think probably they won't, but we would like them to, as long as there's fair treatment for us.
Doesn't the Prime Minister just look like he's running away? I mean, this idea about, oh, I won't do it unless the Greens take part. Oh, they can take part. Oh, no, I won't do it unless, it's like somebody saying, I won't come to the party unless, trying to make more and more excuses.
No, he was clear yesterday. I heard him being interviewed on the Today programme yesterday. He was very clear. He said he wanted to be able to do them, but I mean, he made the point. He when he said that the Greens ought to be involved, you couldn't include UKIP without the Greens, and people actually were slightly rubbish that argument. Well, he was right, because the broadcasters have now come back and accepted actually you have to include the Greens. And I think Simon's point just reflects the fact that we've got a political system now where there are a whole range of parties. Our argument is if you want a stable government that can make sensible decisions, you need to choose us. But there are more parties out there, and if you're going to have debates, you can't just arbitrarily not include some of them and include others. It's more complicated.
Well, everybody said he's happy to debate with anyone. That's the position we have in the end automatically broadcasters, but as I say, we're happy to debate with anyone and put forward the policies that we have.
Thank you very much, and the debate will continue. In Libya, an attack by militants on a Tripoli hotel, popular with foreigners, has killed 9 people, just as the latest round of peace talks have reached some agreement in Geneva, with the apparent promise that a government of national unity will be formed in 2 weeks' time. Ian Pannell has just come back from Libya and explains what's at stake.
Broadly speaking, there are 2 governments, 2 parliaments in Libya at the moment. The government in the east, which is based in Tobruk, that's where the House of Representatives, which was elected last summer, sits. And in the west, you have the government of Libya Dawn, which is a broad coalition of Islamist groups, more moderate, people who are opposed to Colonel Gaddafi, see themselves as the guardians of the revolution. Now, the differences between the 2, there are some ideological differences, but it seems more broadly based around control of resources, about who is the rightful inheritor, if you like, of the spoils of the revolution. And really what happened at the time was that a whole series of city-states almost and tribes rose up against Colonel Gaddafi, and many of them feel that they are more entitled to the spoils of those wars. So the government in the east is recognised by the international community. The government in the west is not, and has been accused by its rivals in the east of being terrorists, of being radical Islamists. The international community has largely challenged the government in the west. When counted in terms of control of the country, they are the more powerful right. Their Prime Minister, Omar al-Hassan, and was in Tripoli last week, and I asked him specifically about this claim about radicals, hardliners,
this way we can build a country. We have to educate the next generation that the country will run by separation of politics from the judiciary. So we open the door, we give rights to minorities. We are the second government. The last government was made up of those educated in Europe. They didn't give the minorities any position in the cabinet. The last Prime Minister was educated in Europe. When we started our government, we gave minorities very important ministries. We gave these people very strong positions. These people are moderate. They are trustworthy. They want to build the country. We're all against terrorists and extremists.
So that's the view from Tripoli, from Omar al-Hassan, the normal Prime Minister in the west. The view from the east, from the internationally recognised government, is very, very different. It's worth knowing that in Libya, real power doesn't really lie with politicians, it lies with the military men, with the militias, with the army. And in the west, that's led by General Haftar, who used to be part of Gaddafi's military, went into exile, came back, and he says that he's fighting tooth and nail to save the country from Islamist takeover. And he's just been speaking to my colleague from BBC Arabic, Faraz Kilani, about the situation in the key city of Benghazi. What had the 17th of February achieved? Killing Gaddafi, we started working in this process from the start, step by step until the Gaddafi system was over. And actually, I did not prefer to end it like that. On the contrary, we wanted to send him to trial, and after the trial we could see what happened. Perhaps he wouldn't be sentenced to death, nor even imprisoned. Maybe he'd be sent to exile, or kept under house arrest. As he became part of the history, so we should keep him. And even if he would be killed, it should have been according to the law, not in such a way.
Ian Pannell. Sir Dominic Asquith is the former British ambassador to Iraq, Egypt, and most recently, throughout 2012, Libya.
I think the situation on the ground has changed, which may afford some hope to those peace talks in Geneva, producing the result that they want, which is consensus at least amongst the sensible minded, over a government that can command acquiescence and allegiance through the country.
Now, we heard from that government in the east, from the Prime Minister of Libya, Dawn, blaming the West, saying there was an early retreat, a quick retreat, which caused us to fail. Is that fair?
I was struck by that. NATO, of course, completed its military operation and then ceased. But the West didn't retreat quickly after the defeat of Gaddafi. The international community conferred on the UN the responsibility to build Libya. And that's what it and others, including the British government, set about trying to do. But it became pretty apparent early on that the fledgling Libyan government was unable to hold a ring against various fiefdoms that were being established and was not capable of taking decisions, let alone implementing any decisions, because the government structures were so weak. That's when I accept we in the West should have been more hands-on, more directed. Ambassador, I used to hear day in, day out from Libyans at that crucial period, in 2011 and 2012, we need help in knowing what help we need. And I think that reluctance to direct on the part of the United Nations, understandable in some ways, was part of the reason why we then entered a period of drift, where power centres became entrenched. Now I think we have to be very, very clear that only those who agree to exclude extremists, take them on and defeat them, should be part of the negotiating process. That a government needs to decentralise the budget to the region so that activity, economic activity, starts. That's what people in Libya want. And to help that government have tight control over the revenues and build up their capability of central forces to defeat extremists. It's a package. But that's where we should be putting our shoulder firmly behind.
Former British Ambassador to Libya, Dominic Asquith. The playwright Tom Stoppard makes you think, often about thinking itself.
Do you ever think of yourself as actually being dead? Lying in a box with a lid on it? Nor do I. Really? Silly to get depressed by it. I mean, one thinks of it like being alive in a box. One keeps forgetting to take into account the fact that one is dead. Which should make a difference, shouldn't it? I mean, you'd never know you were in a box, would you?
Benedict Cumberbatch and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, an old favourite. Stoppard's first new play for 10 years is opening at the National in April. It's called The Hard Problem, about the nature of consciousness. The author said in an interview, the table we're sitting at isn't conscious. Vegetables aren't conscious. We are conscious, and nobody understands how we do that. Physically, scientifically, or metaphysically. Nobody really knows, and that is the hard problem. Well, with me to discuss all that is Julian Badgley, a philosopher and writer, and Sir Colin Blakemore, Professor of Neuroscience and Philosophy at the University of London. And he spoke to Tom Stoppard when he was thinking about writing this play. So, Colin, first of all, how do you define consciousness, and is it the same as intelligence?
Certainly not the same as intelligence, and the computers can be intelligent, but can't be sure that they're conscious. Mind you, we're going to be sure that other people are conscious, and that's one of the big problems. And I would say, offering a definition, it's having an impression that you are the subject of your own experiences, sensory experiences, seeing, hearing things, having pains and so on, but also knowing that, feeling that you're the boss who's making all the executive decisions in your life. It's being a person and knowing it.
Julian Badgley, what's your definition?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with that. I think it's very hard to say what it is other than offering other words which mean similar things. But I mean, it's essentially the idea that if you're conscious, there's something it's like to be you. And although that's hard to pin down, we actually by experience know the difference between being conscious and not conscious. It's a difference between being awake and being asleep when you're not dreaming. Yeah, that's really as clear an example I think you can give.
Well, actually, I think that's not quite right, Julian. Pretty clearly we can be awake, but not aware that we're conscious. I mean, remember, driving a car or something, you can go for miles and miles, and suddenly something happens that draws your attention to the fact that you ought to be aware of what's happening around you. You think, well, oh my God, where was I for the last 10 minutes or so? So I suspect we're not conscious most of the time.
So it's not simply a sense of self, it's thinking about that sense of self.
That's another step. I mean, it's what some psychologists call metacognition, the ability to reflect, as we are at the moment, reflecting on the ability to reflect, and then to reflect on reflecting on reflecting on, being aware of what we're doing, you know.
Well, what makes it so hard to explain what it is?
Well, it might be that we haven't got the right starting point for the question. I mean, a good comparison is with the concept of vital force, which was very dominant in biology in the 19th century, even really up until about the 1960s. The idea that there was something just very special and extra about how cells and organisms works, because they seemed so different in their characteristics from the molecules, the physics and the chemistry, the bits that made them up. We just don't see that word anymore. People in general are very satisfied with the description that science is the invention of how cells and organisms work in terms of physics and chemistry, without having to have some extra magic. Well, I fear that consciousness might be a similar sort of word, and it will end up just being seen as magic.
Well, and of course, one of the questions that people are always asking, do animals have it? Can machines have it?
Well, I think animals certainly do probably, in most animals, have some of it. And I think where I might be slightly different from Colin is that I think consciousness is a kind of a matter of degree. There's that kind of real self-consciousness where you're not only aware, but you're aware of your awareness, like when you realise you've been driving. But I would think that even when we're driving on automatic mode, there is still a lower form of consciousness there. There is some kind of awareness. You're hearing sounds or whatever it might be, or you might be having thoughts in your head. And it would seem that, you know, animals, even some quite primitive animals, have some of the very basic elements of consciousness. And that shouldn't really surprise us. Because
does a pig have a sense of self?
Oh, sense of self, I'm not saying it have a sense of self, but it probably does be able to feel pain, for example, feel fear, emotions like that, and sensations and smells. And those are kind of the more elementary elements of consciousness. And I think it's got to be something like that, because if it's not some complete and utter kind of mystery, it's got to be something that you get more of as the organism gets more complex and sophisticated, as the brain gets more complex and
So, Colin, I've even read some things recently suggesting that plants have a sense of, of pain.
Well, here you see the issue, distinguishing between this thing, and it's hard to use a word without thinking of it as being an object or a thing, this thing of consciousness, from the actions that seem to imply the presence of a thing. Plant reacts to a stimulus in the way that an animal or a person would react, as if when they're in pain. It's very easy to say, oh, a plant must be in pain too. The same could be true of computers, of robots, and so on. Just the presence of the behaviour, the action, doesn't mean that the subjectivity is there, and knowing the internal knowledge. But equally, it could be that giving a scientific explanation of the behaviour somehow just gets rid of the question of the magic of consciousness. That's what many people think, that if we can give a full account of how the brain does...
I'm afraid I could go on talking about this all afternoon, but I do apologise, run out of time. Today's closing headline: Jordan has said it's willing to hand over an Iraqi jihadist in exchange for a Jordanian fighter pilot captured by Islamic State extremists. PM's at 5, this is Mark Waddell, and that's the world at 1:45.
Studio production was by Juliette Dwyer, the editor Charlie Bell. In a quarter of an hour, Jennifer bites the bullet in The Archers. Before that, on BBC Radio 4, Churchill's Other Lives. Today, Sir David Cannadine explores Winston Churchill's vexed relationship with money and his finances.
For most of his life, Winston Churchill's finances were seriously precarious. Although very well born in terms of status, he was not at all well born in terms of wealth. When Winston's father, Lord Randolph, died, he left little apart from debts to the Rothschilds, his bankers. As young Winston wrote to his mother at the time,
"The pinch of the whole matter is that we are damned poor."
This background of patrician profligacy and aristocratic poverty profoundly influenced Churchill's own attitude to money. Because his parents were unable to offer him any significant financial support, Winston was obliged to earn his living for most of his life, as a journalist, writer and author, and out of necessity he worked very hard to do so. He was, as he liked to say, a self-made man. But he was also, like his parents, very good at spending, which often left his finances in a precarious state. Yet when it came to finding money just in time, Churchill seemed to lead a charmed life. If it hadn't been for the occasional intervention of rich patrons and the Second World War itself, he wouldn't have died the rich man he eventually became.
Who wants to be a millionaire?
I don't.
Have flashy flunkies everywhere.
Having decided at an early age that he wanted to live well, and that he would live well, Winston Churchill was thereafter virtually incapable of economizing on anything. He once declared,
"I taste